Welcome to our Sunday School Bible study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, June the 1st. We're starting a new unit of study. We've got 5 Sundays in the month of June, and our study theme for that month is the foolishness of God's people. We're continuing in 1 Samuel. This week our lesson is entitled Foolish Envy. And we're in the 8th chapter of 1 Samuel. Last week in chapter 7, we saw how the people of Israel, after years of being oppressed by the Philistines, longed for the Lord and sought after Him. And under Samuel's leadership, they repented and they won a great victory over the Philistines, and Samuel's role as a judge in Israel was established. So now as we move into chapter 8, we find that Samuel is aging, and that is going to lead to some big changes in Israel. In the first 3 verses in chapter 8, it tells us it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The names of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, but his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and justice. So here we see that Samuel, who had faithfully served as a prophet and a judge, was growing old, and in an effort to maintain some stability, he appointed his sons as judges in Beersheba, down in the south part of Israel, almost 50 miles south of Jerusalem. And unlike Samuel, Joel and Abijah didn't follow Samuel's righteous ways. They were dishonest. And that was a stark contrast to Samuel's integrity. And it kind of left the people disillusioned with Samuel's family here. Our lesson writer points out there's a pattern of unfaithfulness that we see in 1 Samuel, particularly with the children of Israel's leaders. First, Eli's sons were wicked, taking advantage of their sacrifices and their situation. And God pronounced judgment on Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And we saw the results of that in recent weeks. And now, in much the same way, we find Samuel's sons described as dishonest and perverting the course of justice. Whether Samuel should have appointed his sons as judges in the first place is questionable, since the judges were usually a divine appointment. They appointed by God for addressing a specific situation. But in any event, they didn't follow in their father's footsteps. And so that instigates what we're going to see happen in today's lesson. So our first point is verses 4 through 9 in chapter 8. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Therefore appoint a king to judge us, the same as all the other nations have." And when they said, "Give us a king to judge us," Samuel considered their demand wrong, so he prayed to the Lord. But the Lord told him, "Listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you, they have rejected me as their king. They are doing the same thing to you that they have done to me since the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. Listen to them, but solemnly warn them and tell them about the customary rights of the king who will reign over them. The elders of Israel gathered together and went to see Samuel. The elders refer to the respected and influential leaders of the Israelite community. They were typically the older men, wise and experienced representatives who had authority in both legal and administrative matters. So the elders were responsible for maintaining order and justice in their community. And so because of Samuel's age and because they don't want anything to do with a succession that includes his rebellious sons, the elders decide that a king would best suit their needs. Now Samuel had appointed his son as judges. The elders wanted him to appoint a king to judge Israel. The king was to lead them, just like the other nations, all the other nations around them had. When we look down at verse 20, we're going to see that their agenda was that the king would go out before them and fight their battles for them. In essence, the elders' petition here is a response to the failure of Samuel's sons, but it's also an expression of a larger desire there for the kind of national leadership that they saw in other nations. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary, says, when the elders asked to have a king to judge us like all the other nations, they were forgetting that Israel's strength was to be unlike the other nations. The Israelites were God's covenant people, and God was their king. The glory of God dwelt in their midst, and the law of God was their wisdom. The elders forgot that the Lord was Israel's king and the one giving Israel's army the ability to defeat the enemy. So, Samuel considered their request as wrong. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with the concept of a king or monarchy. God had made provisions in his law for the appointment of a king over his people. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, starting in verse 14, it says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us, be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you you're not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. And when he takes the throne of his kingdom, he's to write for himself as a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priest. It's to be with him, and he's to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites and turn from the law to the right or the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. But in spite of that, Samuel was displeased. He felt that they were wrong. He saw it as a rejection of his own leadership. So the question, why was it wrong to want a king? The Quest Study Bible poses that question. They say the people said they wanted a king because they couldn't depend on Samuel's corrupt sons for guidance. Their request was painful to Samuel, though he undoubtedly knew that the people were right about his sons. But Samuel also knew that Israel wanted a king in order to be like the pagan nations around them. He also knew their desire for a king was a symptom of their willingness to reject the Lord as king. As such, Samuel understood the seriousness of their request and attempted to dissuade them. Though the motive behind Israel's appeal was an affront to God, God let them have their way, as we'll see. So, it is significant that Samuel took the matter to God in prayer. He was displeased. He thought it was wrong, but he went to the Lord in prayer. As a man of spiritual insight, he knew that this request was a sign of spiritual decay in Israel. And so it grieved Samuel as he prayed to the Lord for wisdom. Our lesson writer says Samuel's first response to the people's request for a king was to pray to God. Though he considered their demand wrong, he first sought the Lord before responding. That's wisdom that we can glean from Samuel and apply when we're confronted with a problem. As Israel's leader, Samuel felt personally rejected, but first and foremost, Israel was rejecting God. And so it would have been easy for Samuel to misunderstand the problem. Well, in verse 7, the Lord's response to Samuel's prayer was to say, listen to the people. They're rejecting God's authority, for it was He who had sent Israel one able leader after another as they ran into problems because of their own sin and rebellion. And those judges included Samuel. The description of God as King of Israel is frequent in the Bible. It's found as early as the 15th chapter of Exodus. And we easily interpret it as a straightforward metaphor, a convenient human picture, a way to understand our relationship to God. The Israelites were probably apt to do the same, and they failed to see what was meant and applied. If God was truly king, then He made the political decisions for Israel. He made the laws, the Constitution. He decided on wars and alliances. He did everything else that a human king might do in other countries. Of course, God needed messengers to announce His decisions and decrees, and the prophets in particular filled that role. So unless a human king of Israel was absolutely obedient to the Lord's decisions, he would in some way be displacing God. Now, our lesson writer points out it may seem like Samuel and God took issue with the whole concept of human kingship. However, keep in mind that earlier in Israel's history, as we've just read from Deuteronomy 17, the Lord anticipated what took place here. And so it seems that the foundational problem with Israel's request for a king was that in their hearts they rejected God as their king. Their idolatrous motive was the ultimate problem. And the Lord, in verse 8, drew a parallel between the Israelites' forgetfulness of His acts of deliverance and their lack of appreciation for Samuel. As verse 8 reminds us, there was nothing new in the Israelites rejecting the Lord for other gods. He says, since the time God brought them out of Egypt, they had repeatedly turned away from Him, worshiping other gods instead. Now they were continuing that pattern by rejecting God's direct rule and asking for a human king. So essentially, God was telling Samuel here, their actions were nothing new. They had been forsaking Him for generations. So Samuel was told to listen to them, but to carefully warn the Israelites that a king wouldn't solve their problems. In fact, having a king would create many hardships. God says to Samuel, warn them and tell them about the customary rights. Some of your translations say the behavior of the king which will reign over them. These are the rights or prerogatives that the king would claim, and Israel's king would rule arbitrarily and with absolute power. Our lesson writer says, though God allowed Israel the freedom to have a king, he also clearly explained how that would affect their nation and their families. As with Israel, God sometimes allows us the freedom to choose our way, even if it leads to sorrowful results. In our pride, we often think we know what's best. However, God sees more clearly than we can, and he knows and declares the end from the beginning. If we continue to pursue foolish ways, God may allow us to experience the consequences of our actions. The Lord reminded Samuel that Israel's tendency for idolatry began when he brought them out of Egypt. Our sinful nature runs deep, and even though Israel had experienced deliverance from the slavery in Egypt, it's clear that the human heart and its bent to idolatry continues to be a problem for them. Eventually, a better king named Jesus Christ came to change people's hearts from the inside out. God has always been king over his creation, whether in heaven or on earth, but some of his creation in both realms have rebelled against him, leaving destruction in their wake. To restore his broken world, God promised a king who would deliver his people and restore all of creation. The promise of a coming king finds its fulfillment in Jesus Christ and looks forward to its perfection when Jesus returns for his bride, the church. Let's pick up our reading with verse 10 and read verses 10 through 20. Samuel told all the Lord's words to the people who were asking him for a king. And he said, these are the rights of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and put them to his use in his chariots, on his horses, or running in front of his chariots. He can appoint them for his use as commanders of thousands or commanders of 50, to plow his ground, reap his harvest, or to make his weapons of war and the equipment for his chariots. He can take your daughters to become perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He can take your best fields, vineyards, and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He can take a tenth of your grain in your vineyards and give them to his officials and servants. He can take your male servants, your female servants, your best cattle, and your donkeys and use them for his work. He can take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves can become his servants. When that day comes, you will cry out because of the king you've chosen for yourselves, but the Lord won't answer you on that day. The people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we must have a king over us. Then we'll be like other nations. Our king will judge us, go out before us, and fight our battles. So, before deciding on having a king, the Israelites needed to understand what it would mean to them. And so Samuel in these verses presents a grim picture of the side effects of having a king. The elders' vision was a narrow one. All they looked for was an effective military leader, as he says down in verse 20, that will be like the other nations, so that our kings may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. In these verses, there's a word that keeps recurring. The Hebrew verb take appears 4 times in this section, in verse 11, 13, 14, and 16. In our literature's English translation, it's used 6 times. That key word defines the worldly king as a taker. He confiscates property, he uses it for his own ends, sometimes corruptly. And so Israel's desire for a king will be costly. Sometimes in our world, we are warned of the dangers of choosing worldly desires, but we follow our sinful desires anyway. From the earliest scenes of the Scripture, we can see how following our own desires leads to death rather than life. So we're not unlike Israel in our stubborn demand for an earthly king. In verse 11, he says the first thing, the king will take your sons. He will conscript your sons to be his footmen and run in front of your chariots. As we look on down the line, both Absalom and Adonijah, sons of David, secure for themselves chariots and horses, and they have 50 men to run ahead of them. These men are used simply for pomp and circumstance to highlight the status and importance of the king. By acquiring chariots, horses, and 50 men to run before them, they're making a public display of power and authority. In verse 12, because the Israelites want a king who will lead them in war, the monarch will conscript their children to take care of the army's needs. Some will serve in the military as officers. Some will grow crops to sustain the army. Some will prepare food. Some will make the weapons of warfare. So this future king would establish a formal military and administrative structure by appointing captains over large groups, thousands and fifties he mentions. This highlights how the king would build an organized system that would control many aspects of the people's lives. Also, a king would draft young women to work in his palace, serve in his court, become perfumers, cooks, bakers, those kind of things. A king would also take the people's crops and fields. He would take the best of their products. Verse 15 suggests he'd take 1/10 of the grain and their agricultural holdings, and the proceeds from this tax would be redistributed to the subjects of the king and to his military officers. So this helps to centralize the king's power. We're going to see as we study on, Saul attempts to keep his kingship through these very means. So it's a heavy economic burden that the people have to look forward to, effectively transferring the wealth of the people to enrich the king and his court. A king would also appropriate the servants of the Israelites and their finest young men and donkeys and use them for their work. And finally, the king would take away the people's personal freedom. Citizens would be forced into the king's service as well as slaves. So, verse 18 gives us kind of the overall thrust of this. Having a king will turn Israel into a monarchy where the people serve the ruler rather than living freely under God's direct leadership. Samuel warns that when the people eventually cry out in distress because of their king, God will not answer them. That phrase, cry out, we've seen it appears frequently in the book of Judges when the people are oppressed because of disobedience and rebellion against God, and they finally reach the point where they cry out for relief. It's the same term here. the Israelites will respond the same way to their own king. Remember that through the time of the judges, when the Israelites reached the point that they cried out to the Lord, He heard them and delivered them with judges. Now this will change. Our lesson writer points out that throughout the book of Judges, Israel lived a repeating cycle of sin, judgment, and rescue. After Israel felt the effects of their sin and idolatry, they cried out to the Lord, and the Lord would raise up a deliverer. The cry out at the end of Samuel's speech here in verse 18 recalled Israel's cries in the Judges cycle. Samuel, however, presented the impending consequences of their decision clearly. If they demanded an earthly king, the people would have to live with their decision, no matter how hard it becomes. We often make similar blunders, overlooking the faithfulness of God in our lives and leaning on our own understanding rather than the Lord's. And yet the Lord still proves Himself sovereign, just and merciful, and very often turns our evil to accomplish His good and perfect will. Well, verse 19 tells us what they decided. In spite of His warnings, they refused to listen. They continued to demand a king. In the Hebrew, in these two verses, 19 and 20, the pronoun we, our, and us appear 7 times. Their demand is self-centered. It's self-serving. Pleasing the Lord wasn't the priority in the people's mind. They wanted protection against their enemies. They wanted someone to fight their battles, someone they could see and follow. They found trusting an invisible God and obeying His wonderful commandments too demanding. So, this passage is a sober reminder that the human desire to be like other nations by having a king comes with severe consequences. It stresses that the king's authority would lead to extensive exploitation, turning the people into a subjugated, taxed, and heavily burdened population. This prophetic warning is meant to show the stark contrast between God's direct, even though it's challenging, rule through the judges and their oppressive monarchy that the people now saw. As we move into chapter, now that's where chapter 8 finishes. Next week we'll be in chapter 13. So chapters 9, 10, and 11 give us the details of Saul becoming the first king. So let's take a quick look through those chapters to kind of as a prelude to next week's lesson. In chapter 9, it tells us there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, and he was a mighty man, a Benjaminite, a mighty man of wealth or power, and he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the other people. So we see this glowing description of Saul here. And as we go on in chapter 9, it tells us that Kish, Saul's father, had some donkeys who went missing. And the lost donkeys prompt a journey for Saul because he's tasked with going to find them. And it's the trigger for a series of events that lead Saul to encounter Samuel and God's presence. As Saul searches through various regions in Ephraim and Benjamin, and finally at Zuph, which is the area where Ramah is, where Samuel resides, it lays the groundwork here for this divine intervention. At some point in this process of hunting for the donkeys, Saul becomes concerned about his father, worrying less about the donkeys and more about what's happened to Saul. And at this point in the journey, they're near where Samuel lives. So Saul's servant reminds him of Samuel's presence there, a respected man of God, or seer, as he's described, and suggests that they go visit him. And as they approach the city, young women drawing water point them to Samuel, who has just arrived back. We learned last week he had a circuit that he went on every year judging Israel. And the text also reveals that God had told Samuel the day before that a man from Benjamin would be sent to him, one who would be anointed to deliver Israel from the Philistines. So when Samuel meets Saul, he recognizes him as the man that God has promised. And so Samuel greets Saul with honor, seats him among the guests, treasures him by mentioning the lost donkeys have been found, a detail that signals God's providence in all of this. And then Samuel boldly declares that the desires and hopes of Israel rest on Saul and his family. Now, initially, Saul is reluctant. He expresses his insecurity about this. He says, down in verse 21, Saul answered and said, "Am I not a Benjaminite, of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then do you speak to me like this?" But Samuel's actions and words confirm that God's choice doesn't depend on human standards of worthiness. The section continues to make the point that far from grasping at kingship and power, Saul was humbly unaware of his future role. Saul didn't seize power, and Samuel didn't promote some close friend of his own to the kingship. Saul was wholly God's choice. In 1 Samuel 10, chapter 10, it details the moments of divine confirmation and the public unveiling of Saul's calling as king. And that happens through a series of prophetic signs and some public proclamations by Samuel. There's three distinct stages here. Saul was anointed by Samuel. He was chosen by lot, by the people of Israel. And then he was confirmed by public acclamation. Samuel begins by anointing Saul with oil at the start of chapter 10, a traditional act symbolizing that Saul is set apart and empowered by God. And then he provides a series of specific signs that Saul will encounter as he goes back home. He will meet two men by Rachel's tomb who would inform him that his father's concern over the lost donkeys had ended. The donkeys have been found. At the terebinth tree of Tabor, three men will come carrying items such as young goats, loaves of bread, and wine, and would greet him. And their actions will serve as a tangible confirmation of his anointing. And then he will come upon a group of prophets. And there the Spirit of the Lord will fall on Saul, transforming him into another man by empowering him with the gift of prophecy. And that happens. Saul encounters them and he prophesies, and the Spirit of God comes up on him. So immediately following these signs, as Saul prepares to leave, the scripture records that God gave him another heart. This means that beyond his physical anointing, Saul underwent a spiritual transformation here. After these confirmations, Samuel turns to the public realm. He gathers the people again at Mizpah. We saw them gather at Mizpah previously. Now they gather up again. He reminds them of God's mighty acts in delivering Israel from Egypt. And again, he talks about how they demanded a king. And Mizpah, it seems, is kind of acting as a capital at this time. This is where the people are gathering, so it's an appropriate place for this kind of ceremony to take place. Samuel organizes the selection process by calling all the tribes to present themselves, and he narrows it down to the tribe of Benjamin, and then to Saul's family, and finally to Saul himself. And Samuel publicly declares Saul as the chosen ruler by asking, "Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? There's no one like him among all the people." And the people respond enthusiastically, "Long live the king." However, there's a note there. Some rebels said, "How can this man save us?" So they despised him and brought him no presents. But Saul held his peace. The 11th chapter continues this process of Saul solidifying his place as king. Here, there's a threat from the Ammonites down in the southeastern part at Jabesh Gilead here, and the Ammonite king Nahash attacks, and the people are there at Jabesh Gilead are going to give up. They propose, "We'll just make a covenant with you and we'll serve you." And Nahash says, "Well, I'll make the covenant with you under one condition. You let me gouge out the right eye of all the inhabitants." That was a symbol of disgrace. And the people of Jabesh Gilead said, "Well, hang on, give us a few days to think about this." And so they sent messengers out to Israel for help. And part of that, some of the messengers went to Gibeah, where Saul lived. And Saul was coming in from tending his herd, and he heard about the situation. And when he heard about the situation, the Spirit of God comes upon him again. And he's distressed by what is happening. And so he calls the people of Israel to arms. Here he cuts a yoke of oxen into pieces and sends the fragments throughout Israel. And he says every man who doesn't join the battle will face the same fate for his oxen. And so they unite behind Saul, a huge army, 300,000 plus. And the Israelite army divides into three companies. They strike early in the morning, and they slaughter the Ammonites there. Following the victory here, Saul is once again crowned. Verse 14 says, "Samuel said to the people, 'Come, let's go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there.' So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they made sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly." So Samuel's words here, let's go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom, suggests that Saul's kingship needed this reaffirmation. Some of the Israelites had doubted his leadership, but his victory here proved his ability to rule. Gilgal was an important site in Israel's history. It's where Joshua led the Israelites when they crossed the Jordan River, coming into the Promised Land. And so by crowning Saul there, Samuel links this new monarchy with the covenant past there, reinforcing the idea that Saul's rule was divinely sanctioned. So that is a quick look at Saul becoming king. And he got off to a good start, and things look pretty good at this point. Next week, we'll pick up with chapter 12, and our focus is chapter 13. So come back next week, and we'll continue the story of Israel's first king, Saul. Thank you.